This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 414, The Future of Content Management. On today's show, we're talking about the future of content management, what we see for Drupal in the future, and how AI might factor in with guest John Doyle. We'll also cover access policy as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is John Doyle. John is the CEO of Digital Polygon, and he runs his life following three core principles: own it, give back, and build it better. John is passionate about open source technologies and believes in the future of open platforms. His career and company is focused heavily around Drupal and is passionate about continuing to see the technology, the community, and the platform evolve. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Really excited to be here.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are joining us again, Andy Bloom, senior front-end developer at Lullabot.
Hello.
And as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello.
Hey, everybody. Our friends at the Linux Foundation are offering Talking Drupal listeners 25% off of any e-learning course, certification exam, or bundle. It's good from August 22nd to September 30th, 2023, with discount code LFDrupal25. And check the show notes because capitalization is important. Please note that bootcamps, ILTs, and FinOp courses are excluded. Again, that code is LFDrupal25, and you can use that at training.linuxfoundation.org. Thank you to the Linux Foundation. And the New England Drupal Camp is happening November 17th and 18th in Providence, Rhode Island. Here are our friends from Ned Camp to tell us more.
New England Drupal Camp session submissions are open. Ned Camp is happening on November 17th and 18th in Providence, Rhode Island. Friday is a higher education summit and training day. Saturday is the keynote and sessions. Submit your session or training by September 25th. Visit nedcamp.org to learn more and join the Talking Drupal team in New England at Ned Camp. See you there.
We are really looking forward to Ned Camp and hope to see our listeners there. And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Does your Drupal site need a flexible way to manage access to content? There's a module for that. It's called Access Policy, and it was originally created in November of 2022, so it's quite recent. The current version available is 1.0.0 Beta 1, which works with Drupal 9 and 10. It is actively maintained, so in addition to being just recently released, that 1.0.0 Beta 1 was actually just released in the past week. It only has 4 issues, none of which are bugs, and it does have test coverage. There are 12 sites currently using the module according to Drupal.org, and the module creator and maintainer is part digital. Now, the module works by allowing a site builder to define different policies that can be used to manage content access or editing capabilities based on a variety of factors, all defined within the Drupal UI. The criteria can include field values of the content, field values on the current user's profile, the time of day, and more. The policy can restrict access, for example, view access restricted to only selected people or people with a certain role or even a field value on their profile. It can also grant access, for example, to edit content based on the same kinds of criteria. Now, once defined, policies can be assigned manually, or they can be automatically applied based on configurable selection criteria. The project page describes this as an attribute-based access control architecture, which complements Drupal core's role-based access control that our listeners are probably already familiar with. Now, I used this module for the first time recently myself and found that given the power and flexibility the module provides, it's great that it has in-depth documentation because there's a little bit of work involved. I filed a couple of issues, so technically half of the open issues are ones that I filed, and Part Digital was very responsive in getting back to me. The module does also provide an API for defining your own policy type, access rules, rule widgets, and more. So if you need a setup even more custom than what access policy can provide out of the box, it's likely you can extend it to meet your individual use case. So let's talk about access policy.
So am I correct in that I first maybe heard about this at DrupalCon? Was this one of the Pittsburgh suggestions of including something similar to this in core?
I think there is a module that is basically the maintainer of that is the one who did the accepted Pittsburgh submission. It's similar, but I feel like that one is meant to be a bit more of an API, whereas this one really is sort of the like the fully UI realized solution you can sort of install and start to configure.
Got it. Either way, I think like this type of access policy or access control is super necessary and very interesting to me as far as why we haven't thought of this sooner, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say this is really fascinating, and I think it's one of those things that it's a huge value add to the community. But I don't think most projects will need it. But it's one of those things where if a project needs something like this, it's a huge amount of effort to maintain and to. I see that it's supported by Pegasystems. It makes sense that a really large business is kind of behind it because to support the infrastructure to kind of build this from the ground up in a generic way, they must have hundreds of hours into this. I will say I'm curious when this will become supported by the security team, because anytime you have kind of out of the box, or maybe not out of the box isn't the right word, but more unique permissioning, I always wonder kind of what kind of security implications there are, because they must be doing some really, really interesting things to get a lot of those policies to work. So it's definitely something that I think the Drupal community will benefit from long term. It's going to give a lot of control that really just takes custom work in the past. So looking forward to see what happens with this.
Yeah, I feel like in my experience, as you say, it's not every site by any means that would need this kind of, content policy access. But I do feel like I've talked to a number of customers who say, we want to give this team access to edit this section of the website. And that idea of like a section of the website is going to differ from client to client. So it's definitely good that it's as flexible as it is. I have seen some implementations that use sort of more taxonomy-based approaches. So like taxonomy access control or permissions by term are a couple that I think I've worked with in the past. I know at least one of those, when I used it, ended up requiring me to sort of like explicitly assign permissions to every vocabulary, which ended up adding a lot of complexity to the site. So something like this that's not going to interact more broadly with taxonomy, to me feels like it's a better solution.
Yeah, this looks really cool. I haven't seen this one before, but we were talking about something internally similar to this for feature flags releases. So you can turn on and off features in production and release it to various different groups. And it seems like maybe it's worth investigating this to see how those policies are actually defined, because it could just be an extension of this, like outside of just the content editing experience, on how you define those policies and what triggers control that. Really, really interesting stuff. Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out. I'm just trying to figure out what the use case is for time-based access.
Think of a preview link, for example. So I'm working on a project where we have token-based preview links, where you can get a link with a token that allows somebody to see a preview, and you can actually set that to like, hey, it's visible for one day. So like
no. Not length of time, like between 4 p.m. and 6 p.m.
Oh. So the idea, this is interesting, because if, again, this module is not necessarily fully related, but if you look at the Pittsburgh video suggesting that policy permissions be added to core. They talk about organizations that want to prevent their employees from working outside of business hours, right? So like, hey, you can only edit content between 9 and 5 because that's when you should be working. Otherwise, like, go do other things.
That's definitely
and that exact example is also on the project page as well. So I'm sure there are other creative ways that people think of that would make that useful, but again, it's probably not a thing that a lot of sites will need. So
rotating content entry windows. Today's content entry window will be between 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. Good luck.
Yeah, depending on how granular you can get. I mean, there's also, for more applications instead of sites, there's like submission windows for users on certain form submission applications. Could possibly see that. Or for public sites, we've seen this for live chat, but it could be also tied into user applications that live chat's only available 9 to 5 because you don't have someone staffing it. So yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of different ways you could go with that.
Oh man, I just thought of one is event, submitting sessions to an event, right? There's a certain time window for that. Granted, it's days, not hours, but
Yeah.
I mean, I did also do a project in the past that was with a company in sort of the medical space. And so they would do kind of media releases of information before they would do it as a public release, kind of that embargo concept. And I feel like potentially there's a role for that in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
The possibilities are endless.
Yeah, I'm definitely, like I said, I'm definitely looking forward to kind of seeing how this evolves, because it looks really powerful. Like I said, main questions are always security, team support, especially since it's access based, and I guess performance. I mean, the more like access checks you have to perform before something happens. Although I assume they're kind of using the default caching system for permissions. But I can see this project or this project allowing clients to have like 35 access rules for each piece of content. So the first load per user takes 5 minutes, and there's some questions about why it takes so long. But yeah, it looks like it definitely solves an issue that larger corporations have.
Yeah, one last thing I'll say on is, like, without doing this, the alternative is like maybe taxonomy based, but I don't know if you guys have ever built sites that had 20 or 25 different roles, but the role permissions table is kind of a beast.
Yeah.
And that UI becomes unusable after 8 or 9. So yeah, could be a good solution to that. But like you said, it can go the complete opposite way, and you could end up with and I think back to my early days, SharePoint permission schemes with nested sites, and becomes a bit crazy there.
Yeah, the documentation page for this module does talk about role explosion as one of the things that it's trying to alleviate. So definitely aligned with what you said there, John.
Awesome.
Role explosion. Well, thank you, Martin. As always, a great module of the week. Appreciate you bringing this one up. And now onto our primary topic. So, John, before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about Digital Polygon and how it gets started?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I'll start a little bit with my background. I started my career out of college at a company called Sapient, really working on the government services side. And I guess I kind of got thrown into this unique section. Everyone else that was hired with me was doing Java, and I was kind of the guy doing everything but Java. So my first 3 projects were like SharePoint, WordPress, and Drupal, I think. And the big CMS at the time was Percussion, which was the Java-based one. And kind of built my career from there. Did a stint at Acquia. Again, a lot of enterprise architecture work. Moved up to senior architect, and then I jumped over to a creative agency in the city. So I went from this enterprise application development to creative marketing agency, and really got thrown into the deep end there, and was an eye-opening experience because it was a completely different way to build and run websites from what I was used to. Budgets were a lot smaller, things were a lot quicker. We didn't need the same level of scalability and architecture and reuse for a lot of these marketing sites and landing pages and things that we did at the enterprise level. We're talking about 100,000 pieces of content with highly indexable, highly scalable needs. And I guess through that journey, one of the things that I was seeing was missing was kind of the union of those two things. And I decided to start up Digital Polygon so that I could build a web agency focused on building high quality, scalable sites for organizations of all sizes. And my background, as I said, is mainly in Drupal, and we've done a bit of WordPress. So naturally, that's where I focused initially. And over the last 5 years, we've grown to just about 30 people now, and taking on a lot more composable web projects. And I know composable is kind of a buzzword I think we'll get into later today, but really Drupal, WordPress, JavaScript frameworks, a lot of tools as integrations, and trying to pick the right stack for the job that our customers are going through, instead of forcing everything to be done through a single application. So I think there's a lot of mindset shift and a lot of teaching that we do with our customers on. There's not only one right way to do something, and there's no reason we can't pull in additional technologies or, build a one-off landing page in WordPress or HubSpot or Marketo and attach that to our main domain for a small campaign or project, instead of spending 4 weeks in the development cycle building that into our CMS to scale it for something that doesn't need to be scaled. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do now. And one of the reasons that I've been talking a whole lot more about content strategy and composable web is to try to talk through this concept of it doesn't have to be this or that. It can be both. Yeah.
So let's expand upon that, right? So we're talking today about the future of content management. And I think when you say content management, that can probably mean a lot of different things to different people. I'm wondering right now, how are you seeing the term content management being used, and how does that marry with one of the words you actually just used, which is composable?
Sure. So I think content management, the way I'm seeing it used is mainly around content management systems. It's putting a structure to the content that you're putting out there, and being able to update it and make changes to it without having to do code deployments or relying on developers. And it can take many forms. If you think about your marketing tools and your forums and your even your e-commerce inventory and product information, at the end of the day, all of that is basically content management. And if you talk about e-commerce platforms or CRMs, it's content management or structured data with a few additional integrations on it. So back to content management, it's really the ability to manage content, to store it in an offline location, and apply business process rules to it. So content workflow, permissioning, publishing type things around that content, so that you can put it out there into your CMS or into your application or mobile app. And I think it can go way deeper than that, but that's still where I see it, really focused on the content management system space. Though I think it's growing and has been growing as more digital channels open up. So the amount of content that marketers need to manage goes way beyond just their website or just beyond just their mobile app, into the different social channels, into developer portals are becoming a big thing because APIs are being commoditized, and there's just a lot of different touch points on the web as technologies grow and things become more accessible, that I think is why we're seeing this shift towards headless CMS and composable. And I think I saw Forrester just released the new headless CMS or DXP quadrants with a bunch of new challengers in the marketplace. So we're seeing a lot of new technologies come up, but I think Drupal has this amazing place where it can be, it's composable by nature, right? The content management system is built as a modular system. I can put in features, I can change the features, and I can structure them. And there's been a ton of work done into the API management space on this. And I think Pittsburgh was a great example of how we're trending towards this composable web space. I'm really excited to see the outputs of that. I think I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole there, so I'll take a step back.
That's okay. You're fitting right in. We go down rabbit holes sometimes. I'm wondering, as a follow-up, sounds to me from what you just said that like content management is a little bit kind of twofold, right? It's managing the content kind of in one place, but it's also possibly managing that composable layout structure as well, right? So that's kind of how it's morphing, maybe.
Yeah. So if I take just the website example, we've got if I talk about composable websites, I think there's two layers to it. Three. You've got the infrastructure stack, which is what composable is normally used for: microservices, interactions. I can swap out my servers. I can scale. And then I've got the content management system layer, which is I can easily add new features. I can add new modules. I can add plugins. We're talking about Drupal, so that Drupal as an application is composable. It was built that way with the module and plugin system, and is really flexible in that way. And then I think the part that's coming out now more and more is the content layer, and thinking about your content as composable content, because the second that you build your architecture of your site, it can either lock you in or it can give you flexibility. So right. I've seen or inherited Drupal sites where I've got a single body field with custom HTML in it with inline styling. I've seen page builders do the same thing, and that doesn't really give me a really structured content model. It gives me something that ties design and display directly into your content. And then I can go the complete opposite way. I've got extremely structured content, and I've got a field for everything that shows up on my website, and those fields are then read by the front end systems and displayed any way that they would like. And Drupal can serve both ends of this, which is great. And you can either do it all within Drupal, or you can then extend it to a decoupled application, or both, which is a lot of the power of composability here, right? It's let's take our digital experiences, our content, break it down into the way that we need to build it, and not be siloed into one way of doing things. And this is one of the reasons I love open source. I love working with Drupal, is because if we can think about the structure, if we can organize it, we can build it. And there's nothing stopping us from doing that.
So what other factors do you think have been contributing to the change in content management as we've been moving through time towards this more composable and model?
Sure. So I think there's a number of factors. And I think if we look at the wider ecosystem, we're seeing privacy and security really push user data into a centralized storage, right? I've got to know what information I collect on people. I need to know what I have on them. And this is brought to the rise of the CDP and that customer data platform. And this is something that is also trending kind of in the DXP space, tangential to what we're working on. But I'm seeing the same type of consolidation happening on the content side. And I think that the drivers for this is one, privacy, right? And I don't know if you guys have seen I don't know the name of it, but I know there's an EU law that's coming out about making sure that you've got maintainability for your software products that you put out for X number of years after you put them out. And it's really I think, targeted at a lot of hardware and software vendors that just launch a product and then kill support. And it's not fair to people that buy it if 3 months later you're not getting firmware updates or software updates anymore, and they're vulnerable to security issues. So as more and more of this privacy and compliance law comes out, and the number of digital channels that you need to talk to grow, the need to centralize that content instead of duplicate it across all the different channels, and to keep it updated with your brand as it changes, and to keep up with new technologies as they come out. I mean, feels like social platforms are coming out as fast as JavaScript frameworks, and marketers aren't getting more team members. They're not getting more budgets to do this and to target the new channels. They're just expected to do more. And I think as a result of that, the technology has to evolve to be able to support them to do that job and to fit that need. And being able to have structured content around or information that grows and scales with them is the way for them to do that. Content is their lifeblood. It is the medium that you talk about your brand in today's world, right? So I think those are the reasons that we're seeing this shift and this trend. Headless in particular, it's because a lot of the innovation is happening faster on the JavaScript side, JavaScript frameworks with larger people, like organizations like Facebook and Google investing heavily in those frameworks. And, they also control the search engines and the way that people consume that content, and they are altering those algorithms to support those things that they deem as better user experience. So faster time to first byte, faster page loads, smaller footprints. This is how we see that. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that kind of or I guess the bifurcation of like channels, but trying to consolidate the way that you output it, because it's not just new in the last few years. I think the scale is increasing, but if we just take this podcast as an example, we post the actual podcast to Libsyn. It's a podcast specific service, and Libsyn kind of, there's some data that we have to input there, but Libsyn kind of handles the submission to, Spotify and iTunes and like all the different channels that you would generally expect a podcast to be available on. Like I when I'm releasing the show, I don't have to manually log into each of those and upload it, the same file and title to every single one. Now, there are some systems that we have to do multiple in. So like I do upload to Patreon directly, although that's technically a different file because it's a benefit for our patrons. Thank you for supporting us. But I know Stephen recently just started using a new service, I think called Buffer, for managing posts to Twitter and to Mastodon, because a lot of especially our community, because I find open source communities tend to care more about privacy and those kinds of things. Like a lot of them are moving to Mastodon. And we're not going to just drop Twitter just yet, but we want to post to both, at least in the interim. And posting the same, it takes a few minutes to post to both, but it's easy to make a mistake. It's the things that you've been talking about, having the ability to easily tie into a new platform. And it's not just tying to a new platform; it's easily tying to a new platform, I think, and customizing slightly maybe what goes there, right? One platform might require a title, an image, and a subheader and a link, and another might not have a subheader. And like having the ability to kind of say like, hey, this new platform requires this information from this page, when the marketing team is trying to submit something, just makes their job that much easier. And like you said, with the structured content side, you could just create another field for each new platform that you need to integrate with. But forcing them to fill out 15 different titles for the 15 different fields is just additional overhead, additional work, especially if most of the time is always exactly the same, right? So I don't know that there's a perfect solution for this, but yeah, like there's definitely been an explosion in different systems that people have to post to. and it's a problem that I think the world is kind of looking to solve at the moment.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of movement on this across the industry, and I don't know if you caught the session that the Red Hat team did at DrupalCon, but they were talking about how they took their content and put it into a data lake so that they could share it across their various systems. And one of the things about centralized content and grouping this stuff together is every system that accesses it also doesn't have to access the full set of content, right? So I could have a database with 1,000 fields related to an object, and I can expose 20 of them to one application and 30 of them to another one, and really think about it as I'm decorating this universal object. And the way that the important thing here is the content management space, right? And how do I manage my content model so that this doesn't get out of control? I don't have duplicate fields. There's new challenges to take into account here as you drive down that road, but ultimately will lead to more centralized content that is more scalable, and you have more control over what's displayed where, especially as you talk about larger brands, multi-brands, organizations, or franchisees and franchise sites. I think is a really good example of where this becomes really, really important to scale that content.
And I just want to call out to our listeners, if you want to learn more about that Red Hat data lake conversion, you can listen to episode 409. We just had them on.
Nice.
So I'm actually interested in digging in a little bit, right? Because like centralized content obviously is very important. There are multiple different ways that you can manage that kind of centralized content. So like the term we always hear is like omnichannel, right? Hey, basically I need to manage content in one place. It needs to go out to multiple places, right? I've seen a couple of different structures for omni-channel systems, content management systems. You've already talked about kind of headless architecture. There's also obviously coupled architecture with an API first approach, right? I'm wondering, based on your experience, John, what you're seeing organizations kind of gravitate to as far as a way of managing the content for those kind of like omni-channel outlets.
Yeah, so I'm seeing it kind of scattered all over the place right now, to be honest. I see a lot of organizations still using different systems for different applications. So I'll have my social platform, I'll have my web platform, and then a lot of times mobile applications and developer documentation, things like that are still handled in code. And I think as brands scale and as those channels become more important for the success of your business, marketing teams are going to take on more of these channels, right? Your marketers are who protects your brand's messaging. They're the ones that put the content out. They're the ones that know how to make your content sell. And with increased competition in all of these different areas, from low and no code tools and really, I guess, APIs are a good space to look at because they're becoming more and more popular. It's not enough to have data and information anymore. You have to market it to compete with your competitors because everyone has it. Look at streaming, right? Netflix doesn't have everything anymore. Now there's 50 different providers, and you need to market your brand to win that competition. And your API integrations and all of these different aspects of it. So I guess where I'm going with this is having the ability to manage this in a centralized place is I think where we're going. I think most organizations aren't there yet. Now, a lot of organizations I think are still stuck in a mindset of I have my CMS, it's built this way, this is all I can do. And I think what I try to do is break that mindset. Right? Like I don't need to do a huge rebuild of my CMS to get a new feature or a new piece of functionality. I could even spin up a second CMS next to it with some technology or tools that are widely available and proxy it as part of the website. And I can now think about my experiences as smaller digital experiences that are now composable. Like this part of the site's done in the monolithic old CMS. I don't need to update it that much. It's kind of evergreen. It's okay. Here's the new innovative stuff that I need to iterate on much more rapidly. Let's focus on that. Let's build this out. Let's launch it and get this done. Obviously, it doesn't work in every situation, especially when you're doing large branding changes. Like there could be situations where that doesn't work, but I think being able to help educate and train our customers that there is a way to do this incrementally. We can make changes without huge release cycles. Is something that we're seeing a lot of benefit on with the people that we work with.
And I mean, smart. So something you just touched on is right, like big, redesigns and those sorts of things, right? So I think like centralized data models and API first thinking can help alleviate some of those like heavy lifts with some of those like cosmetic things, right? Because ultimately, if your data structure is good and your data is centralized intelligently, right, the front end or the delivery of that data can be changed fairly easily, right? I was going to say it doesn't really matter, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case, because obviously it matters, but it can be changed easily, right? Or more easily than it could be in another buzzword, a monolithic solution, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I've been going back and forth on this and how to position this and talk about it, because monolithic doesn't necessarily mean not scalable, right? Like I can build a monolithic Drupal application with a good content model and still put Storybook in there and still scale it. Or I can build a Drupal site that has a title and a body field and every page is unique, right? And there's no way to scale that. So again, I think it's thinking about the needs. I don't think it's a this or that. I think it's do I need this content to scale across multiple applications? Will I need that in the next X number of years? And like, is this a 2-month campaign landing page, or is this something I need to scale out 1,000 pages for? And we can use those use cases to drive the content architecture and the way that we scale that. But yeah, so I think that's right.
So thinking about centralized data and omni-channel delivery and sending, the data that you have in one location out into one or, potentially infinite different directions, where do you think design systems collide with content management in organizations?
Yeah, I think they're really important. We've kind of standardized on Storybook for anything we do, because it makes things easier to work with and easier to manage. With the exception of really customized marketing landing pages that are typically used as tests or short-lived campaigns, in which case we'll use page builders for those to get them out faster. Just marketing teams can't wait for the cycle on design systems for tests and things like that. But I think having that design system and being able to scale it across your applications gives you that brand consistency and makes it a million times easier to update when you want to make a change to that brand or want to make adjustments. And just like you've got structured content, you should have some level of structured design in order to scale that. And atomic design is still big in my world and something that we work with customers on. And I think that tools and technologies are at a place now where it doesn't cost more to do that if you do it from the beginning. Really, I think it actually saves you time and money in the long run, keeps your brands better positioned because you have consistency across your brands, and that user experience is really important, especially as privacy comes into play and brand loyalty comes back as a thing. We've seen the web go from like anonymous HTML files to logged in portals with subscriptions and access to the Wild West because now we have data and we don't need customer loyalty because we can just do whatever we want with the data that's freely available, to, oh no, we need to worry about customer loyalty again because we don't have that free data anymore, because now we have privacy laws that try to protect users information. And I think we'll see some more iterations of that coming, where brand loyalty and trust is going to be a big driver for brands moving forward. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but we're seeing it more in Europe. The US is passing tons of privacy laws. I think we've got 6 that have been approved now, or 7, with more on the state level, with more coming. And I think that's going to drive some of this as well.
Just wondering, going back to the brand consistency thing, have you implemented any content management systems where you're using something like Layout Builder to provide kind of some of that design system, gates, if you will, to ensure that, like, hey, they're building pages and styling content within kind of that design system, right within the content management system? Or do you always tend to want to keep those separate?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of, I'd say, middle ground builds. A lot of our builds use paragraphs, but I've done a couple of Layout Builder. And I like the word decoration of your content model. So one of the things that we do is, inside of our paragraphs or our components, we can expose layout design options. And so, like, I've got maybe a 2-column component, and I've got some layout options that are like 30-60, 50-50. What color background do you want? Things like that we can expose to give the contenters some level of control over the visibility. And then if I take that and I were to scale it out, those are attributes within the content model of the actual content. And it's up to the front end system that displays it to decide if they're going to incorporate that or not. And I think you can still give that varying level of design flexibility within the constraints that you've outlined in your design system. And it's very possible, as you scale this out to multiple applications, that one application respects it and the other doesn't, because that is a more rigid display model. Or, I can't do a 2-column layout on mobile, so I'm just going to ignore that and just stack it always. That type of thing.
I'm going to take this moment to just plug web components, because it kind of gives you that flexibility. You're highlighting one of the issues with centralized content in a design system, right? The design system gives the people implementing your data into their application the rules that they should follow, but they still need to build, they need to build those rules in whatever application they're building. They need to figure out how to get that CSS kind of on the page, get the HTML structure correct. But if you're using web components, a lot of those styles come along with it, and they're just integrating kind of just generally one snippet. The other nice thing that I found is, with some of my clients, is you can implement container queries in web components more easily. So that means that things like making a single column and ignoring that rule on mobile just becomes part of the component wherever they've integrated it, right? You don't have to worry about, hey, this component is 4 columns on desktop and 1 column on mobile, but they put it in a sidebar that's 400 pixels wide, and now it's trying to display 4 items. Like with container queries, you can just be like, hey, what's my parent size? Oh, okay, I'll use the correct layout based on that. And I've found that using Storybook with web components makes those types of integrations a lot easier when the consumer of the data is a completely different platform. Because if you're using Twig and it's a JavaScript platform that doesn't use Twig as a render layer, well, they kind of have to start from scratch. If you're using React as your components and the end project isn't React or React Native or something, it just can't consume that. Like they're just building that from the ground up and just using your design system as a reference rather than as a resource to kind of shortcut that design implementation. So I'm finding that web components really meshes well with this kind of centralized content, but content entry and management system, but kind of distributed output system, right? Because it allows them to say, like, this is the data I want, this is how I'm going to display it, but they don't have to worry about all the little details of like, okay, how do I make sure the gap is correct in this space? And and the truth is, no matter how, there's exceptions of course, but no matter how detail oriented their front end engineer is implementing it, there's going to be misses. They might miss a particular tablet breakpoint or something on one particular design element, right? But if it's a web component, they're just integrating that HTML and everything's packaged up, and those types of rules will kind of come along, and then really they're just worrying about how do you get the data into that component and get it on the page. So it really shortcuts a lot of that, and I'm finding it works really well for these organizations where it doesn't even have to be a separate platform. Organizations where there's a marketing team that has one website, and then IT has kind of the developer documentation website, right? And they're just different teams that are working on it. They might both be in Drupal, but they might have different philosophies on how they integrate stuff. It makes it really consistent team to team for rendering this stuff. So moving back to Drupal, can you tell us a little bit about why you think Drupal is a good solution for this type of data centralization?
Yeah, so I think Drupal has the being composable in of itself, right? Having the ability to add and remove features gives you the ability to easily pick and choose how you want to display it based on your current needs. And I love the fact that I have optionality there. I can decide if I want to build this completely within Drupal, or if I want to take this completely decoupled because I need a richer, more interactive experience. And I can do that all from the same content management interface for my users. They get a consistent experience. I can get all of the benefits I need from a CMS, and I can implement. I guess the great thing about open source is I can implement anything I want, right? I think even looking at the Red Hat team too, I can even push that data to a third party or a different data structure for storing it, and then reuse that and incorporate it back in. So, one of the things that as you start scaling content, Drupal isn't necessarily the best at is it's database structured for content. Like the structure that they provide is amazing for structured data, but revisions get long, and the way the tables are broken up makes it so that if I do have this really complex data model, the number of tables that I have and queries get really, really big, right? So having the flexibility to not just customize my application, but also use a different database provider on the back end for Mongo or another unstructured database connection gives us really the ultimate flexibility with the application. And we've got a huge ecosystem of developers and companies using this product, so we can control our roadmap better than a lot of the proprietary companies that are controlled by investors driving the roadmap on what's going to sell best next week. So I'm not against proprietary platforms. I think there's a place for them and there's a need for them. But one of the reasons I tend to lean open source more so than proprietary is having that flexibility and that control, and being able to really set up our own destiny here. So yeah, I think optionality, composability is one of the biggest reasons I really love using Drupal for this.
Hi everyone, my name is Suzanne Degacheva. I'm co-founder of Evolving Web, and I'm here to tell you about an event called Evolve Drupal. It's coming up September 8th in Toronto. And the goal of the event is to get you thinking about ways of innovating with Drupal. So we have a great lineup of speakers and content. There's going to be a Q&A with Dries to kick off the event. We have talks about content and design, and we also have case studies from real-world Drupal projects. If you want, there's also pre-conference training. And so far, we have about 100 people signed up. We hope you'll be able to join us. You can get all the details at evolvedrupal.com.
So we've kind of talked about headless solutions, and a lot of this kind of lends itself to a headless front end. I'm wondering how you've seen or if you think that headless helps or kind of hurts the content management strategy. One area I know that you can tend to see some issues, right? And you've talked about this a little bit, is where you have that omni-channel output, you kind of have to think of your APIs and what data is and isn't needed in those APIs in order to make those different omni-channel delivery points successful, right? So I'm wondering, what your feeling is on headless here. Like, is it like, are you all in, or are you cautiously optimistic in regards to content strategy?
Yeah, I think I love the idea of headless. I love the idea of structured content. Headless pushes your organization to actually think about your content structure because you have to, right? And I think for a lot of organizations, that's a benefit. It forces you into that mindset. I can reuse that content. It has its own set of challenges and its own blockers, right? Like, do I know everywhere that's consuming this content? And if I change the structure or I change the value, is it actually going to render properly in all those different locations? Again, it comes down to planning there. I think what I'm trying to stay away from is polarizing headless versus monolithic, because I think there's a use case for both and there's a need for both. And if I try to force everything into one or the other, I'm going to end up with a much more complex ecosystem or things taking way longer than they need to. So if I need something simple that doesn't need to scale or has a short lifespan, headless probably isn't the right solution for that. If I have content that needs to scale, that needs to be consumed by multiple applications, that needs to have a longer shelf life, I think headless is a great solution for that. And I think, I think that's probably where I'd go with it. Is I love the concept behind it. I love the fact that we're structuring data. I love the being able to use faster front-end frameworks. I think let's use the right tool for the right job.
Yeah, I can definitely get behind that. I think that the headless architecture, right? We've already talked about this a little bit, but it allows for quicker changes to front end styles and frameworks, and instead of, it's one of these things that I've talked a lot about with clients, is that like we're getting into this area right now with Drupal and content management system, and where you have your omni-channel strategy and you have your outputs that coming from Drupal APIs, and you really have a nice ability now to not have to take on that big rebuild, every 3 years of a whole website. You can really just kind of reskin your website if you're being smart about your architecture. So I also have seen the other side of it, where people have said like, oh, I need headless. Well, why do you need headless? Yeah, I don't know. I feel like I need it. Right. So I think it's one of those things where you have to be very careful at when you use it. But when you're talking about omni-channel and you legitimately have omni-channel, right? Because there are people that are like, oh yeah, we're going to use this data everywhere. And then it still just lives on the website. You're like, okay, did you really need the omni-channel aspects of this? I think that, headless becomes a little bit more of a value, and I think it also becomes a little bit more of a value at scale too. But again, maybe not the right solution for everybody, but it definitely factors into that content management strategy and the API creation for sure.
Yeah, and I think AI is going to be interesting with this because of how it consumes data and how it's going to consume it, right? What are the specs going to be for AI to come and crawl your website? It doesn't need a spec, but you've got machines now reading your content. I mean, you've always had this with SEO, right? Reading your web content. But does that shift the thing in our API interfaces for telling it how this content should be interpreted across a larger ecosystem? Something that's going to play into this. I don't have an answer for that, but I do enjoy brainstorming on it. But back to, I want to touch on one point that you mentioned, which is decoupling your front end from your back end. There's a number of benefits of that, and I think 3 points that I usually touch on are talent, right? What's my team and what are their skill sets? JavaScript developers are more abundant than Drupal developers right now. So that's one thing to look at. The second piece is like how I can separate concerns, right? So doing deployments to a Drupal application versus doing deployments to a front-end JavaScript application have different security profiles and implications. One impacts databases, one impacts like actual security to my content. The other is just the display of that content. So we can see IT teams being much more lenient on deployment processes for front-end applications than they are for back-end. And that could free up your teams to have really a separation of concerns with doing releases. So I've seen back-end Drupal application teams running 2-week sprints with front ends doing on-demand feature deployments. I think you can still do feature deployments in Drupal if you have the right automation and the right team and the right organization set up. And that's something I'm talking about more now too. But I think the separation of concerns is also an important thing to look at as you talk about enterprise and especially security and privacy concerns as you're doing more rapid development and feature releases.
So I'm curious, something came up as you guys were chatting, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, John. So one of the things that the industry in general and Drupal in particular has been moving away from is the big rebuild every 3 to 5 years, right? And the upgrade process from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 to Drupal 10 has really made, I mean, of course, there's Drupal 7 sites still running 11 years later. That's a separate issue. Yep. But it's made it's one of the selling points of Drupal for enterprises right now, right? You don't have to re-platform from Drupal to the next version of Drupal every other version like you used to. But one of the benefits of re-platforming every 3 to 5 years used to be that's when a lot of the content cleanup, content trimming, cruft cleanup would happen. Like you would be like, okay, let's look at the site as a whole. We don't need these fields anymore. These fields should be combined. This should be split out. Let's write a migration, clean that up, and mark some things for reevaluation. But as we're seeing kind of longer lived repositories for content, how do you see maintaining kind of the architecture of the content going forward, right? You know, for some of my clients, it's just a matter of like, we create a new field when we need to, or split it and delete it and kind of write a small migration. But I'm wondering if you think that Drupal kind of will need tools to manage that better, or what are you guys doing for managing kind of the architecture of a project long term to make sure you don't just end up with, you know, thousands of data points that you're never going to use?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of factors that play into that. Data retention policies and being able to go back and pull up instances of a page for compliance reasons. That might limit your ability to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think if you've got a structured content model, and one of the things that we do is we typically build content models within right now spreadsheets that we use as a living document to kind of mirror the application in a more consumable, holistic format. I don't know I'm sure you guys have seen the migration tool, planning tools, and things like that. So similar to that, but a little. Our content models typically break it up by content types and the paragraphs as opposed to fields, and then pull them in like the import tool does. But that gives us the ability to work with non-technical resources to iron out what are the content needs, what are the constraints, and how we need to move forward. And then we can combine that with governance in the system to determine whether or not we need to keep that data in the database, or we can delete it, or we can move it. And if we've got structured data, we've got a design system, then we can easily scale that content without a huge complexity on the back end if we've got that separation of display, design, and content. And I think there's a lot of power to that. And then, like you said, the back end of that is, what are my data retention policies? How long do I need to keep data for? When can I delete this information? And there's a lot of good modules for helping with some of this, like revision pruning and auto deletion of revisions and things like that. Have been really helpful in keeping database size down. But yeah,
I think that's interesting, because when Nick first asked his question, my head went immediately to documentation, right? So like, I think like you have to document the data model quite a bit. You also, John, you said something great there, which was the living document, right? The data model has to be living. When you make a change to it, you have to, you have to update that document. But I think it's also interesting to look at, how that affects API structure, right? So Nick talked a little bit about like writing migration scripts. You also may have to write, update scripts and to be able to convert a field in an API from one thing to another if need be, right? And then you have to also think about how that kind of ripples through, the consumers of those APIs. So depending on your architecture, it can be very, very different. But I think at its core, right, it results back to the documentation, because inevitably I think we've all probably had projects where we've like come into a phase where we're either pruning or we're re-architecting or we're trying to streamline, and we've looked at a field and gone, what does that field do? Like, why is that there? Who added it? Like, where did it come from? And like, at the end of the day, if you have strong documentation to back that up, it becomes a lot easier to say, oh, that's why we added that. That's actually very necessary for X application that's using, this piece of content.
Yeah, and I think depending what you choose for your API framework is also important with this. I don't know if you all have checked out the GraphQL modules, but they are really powerful. And GraphQL 4 lets you define your schemas and decide what content goes in those schemas. So you have more flexibility in that if you're looking at headless applications. And when I first saw the GraphQL 3, it's got a plugin, I forget the name of it, and this is embarrassing, but it will visualize your entire content model and data relationships in the UI of the GraphQL 3 module, which wow. I just found to be amazingly useful for me to picture my content model and how things interact and how they relate to each other. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend checking it out.
So looking at the trend of where content management has been and where it is now and where it's going, what kind of changes do you anticipate to content management in general in the next 5 years? And how do you see Drupal adapting to that future?
Yeah, so I see a continued trend of content consolidation and being able to use that content across multiple channels. We're doing it now, but I think the need to do this is going to continue to expand. People are going to need to continue to move faster as competition grows and attention moves between platforms faster than ever now. And I think headless is going to continue to be a trend. I think AI is going to probably speed this up faster than we would like. And I'm seeing some of the newer platforms come built on top of AI. And the things that AI can do for your content systems, I think is really powerful. So maybe there's, again, Pittsburgh was a great example of us going and looking at how do we innovate with this. There's a bunch of AI proposals, a bunch of page builder integration API proposals that are going to move that forward. I think all of those kind of feed this same need to pull that content in, but then expose it, make it accessible to multiple places. And I think as we talk about multiple channels, maybe AI helps us do that content variation that we're talking about. So if it knows how LinkedIn needs to format it or structure it, we can have these tools help us take that content across multiple platforms faster within our control. And being able to train your own models, I think, will be a big, as that becomes more and more mainstream and more accessible. I'm seeing a lot in the chatbot space right now and like support systems. So instead of having search on your website, train it on your content and then ask it questions, and it brings up the answers. It's a lot more user friendly. And I know Amazy, I think, released an article about some of the things that they're playing with self-trained LLM models in their architecture. So definitely check that out if you haven't. But I think that's going to drive this forward as well. So we'll see more integration with AI. I think Drupal's primed. There's a lot of work in the community going into AI as well as APIs to get us to a place where we can combine all these tools and have that centralized content that can then scale across platforms. And again, I like the word decoration of my core content model. So if we think, I don't know, if our organization's web first or mobile first, that's our default content model, and then we decorate it for the other platforms or the other networks that we need to do, and find a way to streamline that.
Well, John, thank you for joining us. Thank you for talking about your thoughts on the future of web content.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal, just like we're promoting Ned Camp this week. You learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. John Doyle, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions for you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think LinkedIn or email. It's just John, JOHN, @digitalpolygon.com. I'm also on Drupal Slack, John.Doyle, I believe. So, yeah, you can find me pretty much anywhere.
Awesome. Andy, how about you?
People can find me through the social links on my website, andy-bloom.com.
Awesome. John Picozzi, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.